Welcome to our paper session 2 on Cusan Contemporaries. So we have 3 papers, which we'll do in succession with discussion afterwards. I'll introduce each one as they come up, but we're going from Jean Gerson to Vincent of Aggsbach on Jean Gerson to Vincent of Aggsbach. So that's how we're going to do this. And Sam, are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. So our first speaker is Sam Dubbelman, 5th-year doctoral student at Boston University, speaking on Jean Gerson's Annotatio and the Contours of Mystical Theology.
Thank you. So I will be using a PowerPoint. I will share my screen. I will be looking at some lists today, the Annotatio that was appended to the end of Jean Gerson's De Mystica Theologia, a few of the manuscripts. It also appears first in print. Does anyone know? On someone else's works, Dai E. At the end of Dai E's work on contemplation, the same list appears. So I'm also very happy for the previous talk that the term mystical theology was brought up, and book lists, recommended reading lists in the 15th century. People are writing to Jean Gerson, I'm going to say Gerson, the American pronunciation, writing to Gerson and asking, what should I read? So Gerson wrote recommended reading lists, and Hobbins has an excellent book on this. Is that Hobbins, right? Izbicki? Yes, an excellent book on this that I would recommend, where I got this idea from. So to begin, I want to just lay out some of my questions that I'm asking that brought me into this in my argument. And then I want to look at some of the lists. So one of the things I'm asking in my research is, when did the terminology mystical theology, Mystica Theologia in Latin, when did it expand from the one book by Dionysius to include a concept of theology and then a category of writings where we see lists of mystical theology? This has been one of the questions I've been asking in my dissertation. My first 3 chapters of my dissertation deals with this. So like, for instance, I emailed Bernie McGinn asking, when Eckhart, what does mystical theology mean for Eckhart? And he says, it's not a concept, it's just the title of a book. One book by Dionysius. And okay, and I kept doing that with so-called mystical theologians and came across this problem. Another question I have is, how do looking at book lists, or we may want to use the concept of canons, how might this shift our understanding of the contours of mystical theology? How were people using these lists? My arguments, I have 2 historical ones and then one about the contours of mystical theology. From my studies, mystical theology emerged first as a concept from 1230 to 1250. You see an expansion of commentaries around Paris during this time on the mystical theology. You have Thomas Gallus, Robert Grosseteste, and Albert the Great in a succession of 20 years all write commentaries on mystical theology. Shortly thereafter, Bonaventure's Itinerarium starts off by making a 3-fold distinction between symbolic, proper, and mystical theology. This is the first time I've seen the phrase in Latin, through the databases I'm searching, being used as a concept apart from commenting on Dionysius. And shortly thereafter, more than likely, also in the 13th century, a Carthusian, who we refer to now as Hugh of Balma, writes a treatise, Via Zion Legunt, the way to Zion mourns. and from what I can tell, this may have been one of the first treatises to receive the title De Mystica Theologia, other than the one by Dionysius. So this gets referred to as On the Threefold Way. It gets titled that, and it also gets titled De Mystica Theologia. And who does this get attributed to? Bonaventure. And it's included in all 16th century printed works of Bonaventure that I know of under the title De Mystica Theologia, attributed to Bonaventure. Okay, so my argument about one of the contours is, as I've been looking at some of these lists, especially from Hugh of Balma forward, I think mystical theology was increasingly understood in the 15th century and 16th century as an advanced form of wordless or imageless prayer. So an advanced form of contemplation that moved beyond mental images and words, vocal prayer, to some kind of what we might call mental prayer. So it specifically dealt with, and you see this in Balma, how does one pray like this? What posture should you use? And then it maps onto who should be praying these kinds of prayers, and it maps onto the perfect. It's another argument I'll make. Those who have advanced, not beginners, not proficient, but those who are, however we make sense, it's the perfect, are those who should be reading these works of mystical theology and praying like such. I'm just going to quickly move through this. This is where I came across my idea. I was taking a class with David Hall at Harvard on Puritans, and I'm searching the early English books online for mystical theology and mystical divinity, and I came across this list. It's written by a Protestant, so it's not the most appreciative description of mystical theology, but nevertheless, this was my first encounter with some lists. And some of these names, I had to stop and say, who's Blosius? Who's Barbenson? And so it's really fun working with these lists where you get the Latin names, and you have to sometimes do some discovery work even just to figure out who people are. Well, I figured out Blosius is Louise Blois, a 16th century French writer who was quite well known, but McGinn has a very small treatment of Blosius, but I think was more well known in 16th century. We see some names we know, and there's two Lutherans on this list. Jakob Burma, and where's the other one? Do I not have him here? See the Vigalus down here? Another Lutheran. That's interesting. Maybe I forgot Weigel in my own list on the left side. So this is what got me interested in the list. It's not what I'm talking about today, though. So Denys Turner in The Darkness of God, one of the last chapters, has a treatment of Denis the Carthusian, where he says very hesitantly, Book 2 of this treatise might contain one of the first canons in Latin of mystical theology. And this was in 1991. So, and I think he's still working on Denis the Carthusian, so I don't know what he's going to say about this then. And here's Book 2, the list of the figures. Thomas Aquinas is really interesting. Yeah. So I want to just say a big but. When I've been tracing the terminology and when I've gone back to this, the terminology mystical theology in Denis the Carthusian is not used in Book 2 to describe these writings. It's used in Book 3. And the structure is quite explicit that Books 1 and 2 deal with proper theology, which we think of as affirmative. And Book 3 transitions to mystical theology. So I wrote down, Denis the Carthusian says proper theology, quote, is speaking in positive terms of God's supreme intelligence and perfection. Mystical theology, on the other hand, quote, contemplation of God through negation and through an ardent and instant love. Another complicated matter is that a previous list that I'm going to be talking about, this Annotatio, existed before Denis the Carthusian. Another interesting list I'm going to tell you about that I've just recently discovered. In Erfurt, the Charter House has a library catalog that is now online at this website, makingmysticism.org. It's a great site. It's transcribed, and there's facsimile scans, digitized scans of the manuscript, which I've included here, of the various books on hidden theology, most hidden divine theology, which is called mystical. And I haven't written out the whole list. Starts with Dionysius, goes to Thomas Gallus, has Gerson, then Hugh of Balma, and other names, and has Rusbrook as well. And it's annotated. So this is a really interesting source. And it's interesting for me because Luther studied where? Erfurt. I mean, he wasn't a Carthusian, but maybe he comes across some of his mystical texts like the Theologia Deutsch here. Okay, so now we turn to the list I'm actually supposed to be talking about. Gerson's Annotatio. Some list of teachers who have spoken about contemplation. So when I say this is Gerson's list, I'm not trying to make an argument that Gerson wrote this. I'm saying that it was attributed to Gerson, appended to the end of his manuscript, and does a good job actually representing the sources that were used in De Mystica Theologia. So there are 9 names, there's 5 anonymous treatises, and 28 titles. This is one of the interesting things. It's not just names. The first one we looked at just said Blosius. And you're like, okay, what do I read by Blosius, right? This has Dionysius, then read mystical theology. It has Augustine, read On Religion, read the Confessions, and one other one by Augustine. I can't remember off the top of my head what it was. By Bonaventure, it has the Itinerarium, the Threefold Way. And then here we see, why are these in blue? It's because all of these works get attributed to Bonaventure. So you have Hugh of Balma's Road to Zion Mourns. You have something, the 7 itinerary eternal roads. Tom Izbicki has emailed us asking about this one. And so this is a source that was being listed and recommended. So I'm going to just offer some comments on this list and then talk about the contour. One of the interesting features of this list that I've thought about it is it jumps from Dionysius to Richard of St. Victor and then goes back to Cassian and then kind of moves chronologically through to the modern treatises. So I think that's interesting that it jumps forward to Richard of St. Victor and prioritizes Richard of St. Victor. So we could say this is seen through the lens of the school of St. Victor and prioritizes that. I'm going to look at my notes real quick just to make sure I'm getting what I want to say. I think this is actually a perceptive commentary on the reception of mystical theology and Dionysius in the terminology as I've looked at it. So rather than a gross error in chronology, the jump from Dionysius to Richard represents a fairly accurate view of the Latin reception of Dionysius. So the figures from Cassian to Bernard did not interact with the writings of Dionysius, but either wrote about practices of pure prayer, such as Cassian, or prioritized love as knowledge, such as Augustine, Gregory, Bernard, or provided versions of contemplative itineraries, such as Climacus and Bonaventure. It would, of course, have been impossible for Cassian or Augustine to read Dionysius, but the absence in later writers like Bernard is more interesting. So while Bernard made much of the theme of loving union with God and describing it in terms of 3 progressive stages, Bernard did not associate his teachings on this subject with the writings of Dionysius or with the terminology mystical theology that I'm aware of. And I'm stealing this from Anthony Gilson. Richard, Hugh of St. Victor, and Bonaventure, on the other hand, did draw heavily upon Dionysius and associated the superiority of love over intellection with his teaching. However, it was not Richard or Hugh who first labeled such an approach with the Dionysian term mystical theology, but Bonaventure. Some of my thoughts on this list. as I've interacted with the terminology. Here's the excerpt from Dai. It's the same exact list right here that we had. So, and you get to see the whole thing. So here it jumps from Dionysius to Richard. Here's Augustine, Climacus, Gregory, Bernard, Hugh of St. Victor. And here's the 5 treatises. There's Bonaventure, the Itinerarium, and the 5 more recent anonymous treatises. Jason, how am I doing on time? Okay. So I'm going to conclude by talking about the contours of mystical theology. This is a very well-known quote of definitions of mystical theology from Gerson, from the speculative treatise, Consideration 28. And I'm just going to read it. This is my one big quote, and then talk about mystical theology as perfect prayer. So we may define mystical theology in the following ways. Mystical theology is the movement of the soul into God through loving desire, or mystical theology is an anagogical movement that is leading upward to God through pure and burning love, or also mystical theology is experiential knowledge of God. This is the one that gets quoted a lot. Acquired in the embrace of unitive love, or also mystical theology is wisdom, that is a sweet knowledge of God obtained when the highest summit of the effective power of the rational soul is united and joined to him through love, or else, according to Dionysius in the 7th chapter of On the Divine Names, mystical theology is irrational and insane, or that's a logos, in a foolish wisdom surpassing all praise. So Jeffrey Fisher, but Chris Bolito might be aware of this chapter because it's in the companion to Jean Gerson by Brill, has a helpful summary of that passage and has 4 points, or 3 points, and I want to add a 4th one. So of those definitions, Jeffrey Fisher says the object was ecstatic union with the divine. Number 2, union was achieved through the, not he, effective power of synderesis or apex mentis. This is typical stuff to talk about. Number 3, the cognition or the knowledge of God consisted more of intimate acquaintance rather than understanding in any strict sense. This is Jeffrey Fisher. I want to add, turning to the practical treatise, mystical theology was a practice of perfect prayer or pure prayer for the advanced religious. So I think the so-called mystical triad you see in Hugh Balma and others from purgation, illumination, and union begins to be mapped onto, in Balma and in Gerson, to the perfection triad. And this is explicit in some places. It was for the perfect. So beginners were more in purgation, the proficient or those making some progress can transition into the illuminative way, and the upsurge of union was for perfect, however defined. 2 characteristics of this, it's beyond words. I like this quote. We insist that this goal be sought with all the energy of our affections. Let silence tire you out and let yourselves become heavy with it. Learn to sit in silence and learn to move away from vocal prayer. And then Gerson, in the last consideration of the practical treatise, says it's not only beyond words, it's beyond phantasms, mental images, and insists that this is what Dionysius taught. And this is a practice of prayer. It's not just talking about intellect and affect and anthropology or cognition, theories of cognition. This was talking about how does one pray and enter into mental silence. So those are some of my musings as I've looked at this list, and I've made the argument, some historical ones, when does mystical theology get used? When does it expand to a list of mystical theology? It does so in Gerson, and I've tried to point out that one of the contours of mystical theology, as I've looked at this list, was that it was being understood as an advanced form of, I want to almost say, mental prayer for those who are considered perfect. Thank you.
So our second presentation in this session will be by someone who I think is well known to all of you, Tom Izbicki, who tells me he's not a founding member of this society, but he's been here almost since the beginning, which is good enough. Kind of like St. Paul, you might say. Excuse me. Tom is emeritus from Rutgers University. And should I say Gerson for your paper also? Or Gerson? I'll say Gerson. Tom's paper is Vincent of Aggsbach's attack on John Gerson.
I considered some of the mischief I've been gotten into through David Albertson and Meredith Seabart. I started doing.
Take your mask off.
Oh.
It'll be a little clearer. Thank you.
Yeah, I hate talking through a mask anyway. I got consulted by Meredith Seabart on the Tegernsee project. The next thing I knew, I was a participant. This is some of the mischief it's gotten me into, especially I've gotten interested in Vincent of Aggsbach. Vincent, Carthusian prior of Aggsbach, in his dispute over the nature of mystical theology, lumped three opponents together as Kumar in a note against Marquardt Sprenger written in 1455. This combination identified the Paris theologian Jean Gerson, the concilius turned papalist Nicholas of Cusa, or Cusanus, and the Munich theologian Marquardt Sprenger, whom he regarded as erring in this matter. Others Vincent attacked included Bernhard von Wagner, the prior of Tegernsee, and the theologian Johannes Keck. It's easiest to focus in this Tegernsee debate on Cusanus, especially in this context. My purpose here is to expound on why Vincent attacked Gerson, whom he dismissed in scorching terms. Vincent's criticism of Gerson began innocently enough, he says. He had copied in his own hand short texts on mystical theology written by the Chancellor of Paris. Vincent admitted that at first he read these texts superficially, then he went deeper. This places Vincent centrally in the role played by the Carthusian house at Aggsbach, together with that at Buxheim, in the diffusion of Gerson's text within the Danube watershed. Notable recipients of these texts include the Carthusians or outside Carthusian circles were the Benedictines at Tegernsee and Melk. Vincent, in an extensive letter to Johann Schlittbacher, prior of Melk, said that he had been reading Gerson's texts more exactly and diligently on the Feast of Nativity in 1452. He realized, he claimed, that the same venerable doctor does not always agree with the text of Dionysius, nor with the expositions of it. But the Carthusian does not say, as Bernhard von Wagner cited Gerson's texts, including his Anagogicum, as guides for seeking mystical wisdom. Vincent had a traditional view of Dionysius as the man Paul converted on the Areopagus. What Paul had learned when he was rapt to the seventh heaven, which we find in 2 Corinthians, he revealed to Dionysius, who in turn, lest these things be forgotten, committed them to writing for the utility of future persons. Among his books, Vincent noted most prominently the mystical theology, but to be a negativa theology. The expositors Vincent mentioned were Gallus, Grosseteste, and Hugh of St. Victor. Perhaps more damning, Vincent claims that the Chancellor did not agree even with himself. Vincent insisted that these major writers rated affect higher than intellect in the pursuit of mystical experience, saying Dionysius and his commentators thought that union with God could be attained without the intellect. This places him in a tradition of interpretations identifiable with the Victorines. Vincent added that to these writers, a fellow Carthusian, Hugh of Balma, whom he thought faithful to Dionysius and his commentators. Hugh, as Vincent said, believed assent to God could be achieved without previous cognition. That assertion placed Hugh in the line of fire in the Tegernseee debate or fides ratio controversy. Moreover, Vincent kept Hugh's name to the fore in his letters to Schlittbacher and a note he wrote against Marquardt Springer. Springer, who was eventually Vincent's major opponent after Cusanus took to ignoring the Carthusian, was particularly concerned with refuting Hugh's effective theology. In fact, the third part of his Elucidatorium Mysticae Theologiae was known as the Contra Hugonem for its attack on Hugh of Balma. Having noted these things, it is best to state in some detail Vincent's reasons for attacking Gerson. This attack on the chancellor is based on 6 of his texts. These covered a span of nearly 3 decades, from Gerson's earlier writing career to the work which he was doing in his last days. The earliest of these was the De Vita Spirituale, an example of his original penchant for effective theology. Next in chronology comes the De Mystica Theologia Practica, known to Vincent as the 12 Industries. A monument to Gerson's earlier theology is the Consolatione Theologiae, where Vincent was brought up short by a transitional text, Gerson's Anagogicum de Verbo Hymno Gloriae, which de-emphasized affect, teaching that one left it behind when entering the mystical darkness. Gerson believed that with that text, he had a better understanding of Dionysius than he had ever had before. From that same period came the Super Magnificat. Vincent also knew the Super Cantica Canticorum, the last of Gerson's spiritual works, taking up interpretation of the Song of Songs, which the chancellor had previously avoided. Vincent showed no awareness of the chronology of these texts throughout this controversy. Vincent employed 3 translations of Dionysius. He demonstrated his knowledge of them by citing from each a passage in which Dionysius said to Timothy that mystical experience went behind the senses and intellectual operations. He was particularly fond of reading Dionysius's meaning when ascended unknowing. One version was found in the widely diffused translation of Eriugena. The second, that by Grosseteste, the Carthusian, cited almost certainly from Rudolf von Biberack's De Septem Itinerarius, a text often falsely attributed to Bonaventure. The third, which Vincent identifies as by Thomas Gallus, was the version by Johannes Sarachenus, on which Gallus commented. Vincent followed with quotations from commentaries by Gallus, Grosseteste, and Hugh of St. Victor. Vincent's conclusion was that Dionysius thought that affect arises without admitting the intellect. It was here that Vincent begins to criticize Gerson in detail. He said that the chancellor strove to equal or even prefer to those accepted writers, men of his own ilk. Carthusian admitted that Gerson tried copying a work that he himself had found impenetrable, the De Septem Itinerarius. Even after much study, Vincent added that his attribution probably was derived from Gerson's concerning the Song of Songs. He expressed hesitation about this attribution since a text concerning the Magnificat is introduced by Gerson in a similar manner. Vincent's attack on Gerson became more specific when he approached the chancellor's pedagogy. This text, as Jeffrey Fisher said in his dissertation, showed that Vincent knew Gerson had changed his viewpoint there, although he did not understand what Gerson intended with his new understanding of Dionysius. Pedagogy being the sense of scripture concerned with spiritual or mystical meanings, a term may have caught the Carthusians' attention. Here he quoted Gerson as saying, "The rational spirit, when it ascends to God by anagogy, leaves behind all operations, especially as intellectual ones, but even effective and lovable and pleasant ones." Vincent believed that cognition was being privileged over affect, which was not correct. Therefore, he described Gerson as contradicting the expositors of Dionysius. He feigns his own way in which one does not rise unknowingly. Vincent accused Gerson and others, especially Cusanus and Keck, of fabricating meanings in opposition to the expositions of the mystical theology. Paraphrasing 1 Corinthians with its references to sects among the Christians of Corinth, who claimed allegiance to Paul, Apollos, Cephas, and even Christ, he said that there can be schisms among those who follow Hugh, possibly Hugh of Balma, Gerson, Keck, or Cusanus. Then Vincent adds a warning by Paul in the letter to the Hebrews against being led astray by strange teachings. Moving to criticism of other works by Gerson, Vincent quoted concerning the Magnificat about mystical theology being concerned with the union of work collection, experimental and gratuitous, of the mind with God. In contrast, the Carthusian employs a text from concerning mystical theology. Mystical theology is the extension of the soul to God by the desire of love. Mystical theology is anagogic motion that is leading above to God by fervent and pure love. Vincent added that Gerson did not accept what he did not wish to believe. Moreover, Gerson did not wish to follow Dionysius or Hugh of Balma, whom he quotes in terms of claiming unitive love. Vincent went on to cherry-pick Gerson's works for passages which he said he could disagree, finding texts to quote, especially from concerning the Magnificat. In that text, Vincent draws a qualification about rising by love by saying, not that love is entirely without previous cognition, according to the imagination of the one mystically theologizing. This statement he treated as departing from the foundation laid by Dionysius. Having cited one of Gerson's last works, the Carthusian cited the earlier concerning the consolation theology. There he quoted Gerson as saying, rising without previous or accompanying thought could be heretical. Even Gerson's effective theology gets criticized for writing about acts of love. Such a disposition of mind, according to Vincent, would require almost infinite acts of voluntary love. Returning to the exposition of the Magnificat, Vincent said Gerson came near the truth when he says that the quest for divine wisdom ends in the darkness where God truly is hidden. This required leaving behind every cognition or affective act about every creature, even itself. Dealing with the same text, Vincent notes the stages of leaving behind things in mystical ascent. First, the operation of senses, then intellectual operations. Dionysius said that this included all being and not being. Gerson allowed for an exception without any supporting authority. Turning to the work on the Song of Songs, Vincent quotes Gerson, leaving behind all things created. This dumbfounded the love or affect of the mind, Vincent noted, that this was Gerson's last work and that he died a few days after its completion. Also completing his examination of Gerson's mystical theology, the Carthusian offered a very negative assessment of the venerable doctor, saying he slept or was absent in writings, accomplishing nothing of use. And he wrote in these texts, he smothered in some way the usefulness of the other things which were closer to Vincent's own theology. Further, he complained that Hugh of Balma was little known when Gerson was considering a name among the names of the great on the earth. This led to contempt of useful and good writings. His own works, however, as he said of Gerson, were useless and sterile. Looking at what he considered to be Gerson's motivation, Vincent thought the chancellor was trying to reconcile mystical theology with scholasticism and the philosophers. Scholastic theology, according to Carthusian, reading, studying, and understanding sacred scripture, the Old and New Testament. Mystical theology was a singular way of mental extension into God. Vincent then said the difference between Gerson's thought and that view of Obama should be investigated. Whereas Vincent had described Dionysius' works as foundational for mystical theology, in this context, he dismissed Gerson's theology as resting on his own assertions. He instead tested his theology on the works of Gerson, that is, Hugh of Alma. Hugh's theology had the taste of good wine, while Gerson's was like tepid and turbid water. Vincent added a more pastoral concern, saying that if Gerson's theology prevailed, it would exclude the unlearned and simple and little women from grasping that art. At that point, Vincent left off the comparison of the two writers, Hugh and Gerson. Vincent might have cut off his text at this point, but he could not resist going further. He went on citing Gerson as writing against those things and thinking badly. And the Carthusian applied this description to Kemp and to Keck, Cusanus, and to Gerson himself. He also went back to Gerson's concerning the spiritual life, proving that you could transfer yourself from theology of the intellect to theology of affect. He made a similar argument concerning mystical theology, backed up with references to Hugh of St. Victor and William of Paris. Vincent went on arguing for the theology of affect from Gerson's own works. He might have cut off the date he gives in June of 1453, but he noticed another passage in Gerson's mystical theology. You can actually see the man thinking his way through this. A snake hidden in the grass was what he found. Consequently, he added for 2 further pages, according to Van Steenberg's edition of the letter, contrasting contemplation with mystical theology. Vincent clearly thought Gerson had shown evidence of embracing effective theology, but then had muddied the waters with other thought and he desired to reconcile the mystical with the scholastic. What remains to be considered is whether Gerson's name remains central to the Tegernsee debate. Certainly the question of intellect versus affect remains central, along with the relationship of faith and reason. However, no other text edited by Van Steenberg in this context mentioned the chancellor by name. However, Marquard Sprenger cites Gerson once in his responses to Vincent's polemics. This suggests that Gerson's theology played a significant role in setting off the Tegernsee controversy, but he may have ceased to have had a significant role almost at once as Vincent of Aggsbach completed his polemic against the chancellor, but sent everybody off in arguing about Hugh of Alma. Thank you.
Thomas. Yes, you were muted. Good. Welcome. So our third speaker via Zoom is Thomas Woelki, who is a researcher, which is, he says, tantamount to assistant professor at Universität, Humboldt Universität zu Berlin. He also works on the Acta Cusana, and he will be speaking on Vincent of Aggsbach as letter writer, themes, objectives, and communicative strategies. Thomas?
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm very grateful that I can participate in at your conference, even from Berlin. So greetings from Berlin, and I'm especially grateful that you did not schedule me at 2 a.m. in the morning European time. So I have presentation 2, so I will share my screen. So you see my screens? It's okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfectly. Okay, so the letters of Vincent of Aggsbach are a central element in the so-called mystic debate of the 15th century. Professor Izbicki has just analyzed them in an unsurpassable way. My contribution is to present some thoughts about the character of this correspondence. So for the understanding of the debate about mystical theology, which is the focus of this conference, such an approach seems to be useful. Just let me show one example from the correspondence directly. So here we see that Vincent blames his correspondent partner for passing on his writings and thus provoking the debate. And he did so several times. So it is obvious that Vincent and Johannes Schliedbacher had different ideas about the conventions of their correspondence, and that for a long time. And nevertheless, the correspondence continued. So it has to be integrated into contemporary conventions of letter writing, and that's what I'm trying to do. So my first point, late medieval epistolary culture. Research on late medieval letters is booming, at least in German-speaking scholarship. The observations clearly point in one direction, the orientation towards the recipient. Late medieval letters are not primary expressions of individual convictions. Every letter has a purpose to which it wants to provide the highest possible chance of acceptance by the recipient and his social environment. Therefore, the letter writer is well advised to take contemporary conventions as a reference. They offer him a multitude of possibilities how to shape the actually uncontrollable situation of the reception of the letter. Long practiced habits were recorded in numerous sample letters for this purpose, and these letters were kept in collections, especially in monasteries. The manuscript 1767 from Melk Monastery, which is the most important for us, is only one example of such monastic collections of letters. In it, the Melk monk Johannes Schliedbacher accumulated dozens of letters which he had received primarily from monks of other monasteries, and which show him to be a highly networked correspondent. From the Carthusian Vincent of Aggsbach alone, he copied 25 letters. For us, it is important to classify this correspondence in two ways, methodologically and thematically. Both should contribute also to the understanding of the debate about mystical theology. So my second point, letters of Vincent of Aggsbach. The most unusual external feature of his correspondence between Vincent of Aggsbach and Johannes Schliedbacher is the spatial and thus personal proximity of the two correspondence partners. The two monasteries, the Charterhouse of Aggsbach and the Benedictine monastery of Melk, are just 13 kilometers apart. It's a walk of 2.5 hours or a short boat ride on the Danube River. Schliedbacher, at least, is also documented several times in Aggsbach, so they knew each other very well. This has major implications for an essential phenomenon of late medieval correspondence. The letter writer has various possibilities for expressing and negotiating the status of their relationship. Likewise, the hierarchical disparity between the persons involved could be depicted in a very subtle way. In our case, we recognize a slight but sensible hierarchical imbalance. Vincent of Aggsbach was about 70 years old, around 1460, Schliedbacher 14 years younger. As a Carthusian, Vincent was recognized as belonging to the stricter order. Moreover, Vincent had been prior of his Charterhouse for many years. On the other hand, Schliedbacher was at this time the prior of Melk, at least for temporary. Vincent usually limits the salutation to a dilecte mi pater. No elaborate blessings, hardly any praise and reverence. And when he once condescended to a captatio benevolentiae, he combined it with a brusque rebuke. So why do you ask me something like that when you know much better about it yourself? You are a sheep and want wool from me, the goat. Reprimands and rebukes run through the letters like a constant refrain, sometimes even to the point of sarcastic mockery. It is good that you wrote this nonsense on a weekday, otherwise you would have dishonored the holiday. We do not know Schliepbacher's exact reactions in each case, but we do know that the correspondence was not disturbed by such things, but it was perceived as all the more friendly and harmonious. For the prior of Aggsbach, Bartholomeus, who was appointed in 1459, this exchange, which lasted for many years, was the most important basis for friendly relations between the two monasteries, Aggsbach and Merk. This shows the outstanding importance of the constant status update, neither on the side of the sender nor on the side of the recipient. One could assume a strictly personal communication. The outgoing correspondence of Vincent of Aggsbach was, of course, known to the respective prior. We can see this very clearly from the original note of the prior Thomas of Aggsbach, which is conserved on one of the letters. Here we see also a note that the letter was only to be handed over to Schliepbacher personally. This was necessary because one always had to expect that letters were read out in the monastery and their contents circulated there. In general, it was quite common that letters or fragments of letters circulated even in other monasteries. In this way, a great conversation arose about questions of everyday life in the monasteries and about political developments, which was decisive for all involved. Mystical theology was also the subject of this great conversation. When Vincent of Aggsbach encouraged Johannes Schliepbacher in 1453 to further pursue the questions of mystical theology and to share his ideas with others, quasi tuba exaltate vocem vestram, he seems to have entered directly into this discourse. So how could he assume that Schliepbacher would keep the Carthusian's writings to himself? The conventions of letter writing provide a possible answer. Let us look at the letter from Bernhard of Waging to Johannes Schliepbacher, which arrived in November 1459. At this time, Waging had just been informed of Vincent's attacks against his writings, and now he had to react on them. However, he was not in the position to jeopardize the good relations with the Melk monastery, also because at this time, Tegernsee was seeking quite of mutual congregation with Melk, and Waging had to negotiate this. So he responded in a very polite manner. He humbled himself and praised the piety and spirituality of the Carthusian. But in the same letter, he enclosed two other letters, writings, typical technique, which was labeled the cedula inclusa, the enclosed sheet of paper. This, the first cedula contains factual but clear criticism of the Carthusian's argumentation. The second cedula inclusa, or how to say, so to say, inclusissima, however, was formulated in a much more polemic way. So even an impulsive outburst into German language. Oh, friends, stop that. Where are you going with this Kunz or Hans? Du bist ein wilder Kartäuser. You are a wild Carthusian. So Schliedbacher could now decide, having these three versions of the same letter, he could now decide which letter he forwarded to Aggsbach and distributed among the monastery public without anyone losing face. This technique of the cedula inclusa corresponded perfectly to the customs of this time, and it was also fundamental for the letters of Vincent of Aggsbach, even for the issue of mystical theology. For if we look closely, the central statements of the Carthusian on this subjects enlisted by Professor Izbicki, they are written on such cedulae. See, one of them is even preserved in the autograph original and was bound into the collection of letters. So Vincent himself wanted these cedulae to be understood as a sign of mutual friendship. And he clarifies, not participation in discourses, but involvement of the friend in inner activities. So per cedulam visitare, the decisive passage. This was the goal of these writings. The texts themselves were not scholastically composed treatises, but typical products of Carthusian writing practice. Reading excerpts and spiritual thoughts are always reformulated and thus all the more profoundly experienced. So writing as a sensual experience. The products of this contemplation with the pen are not intended for external discourse. Vincent invites his friend into his cell and shares his silent solitude. The conventions of letter writing practice left certain safe spaces in which even contents that were actually inappropriate could be addressed. Vincent of Aggsbach moved hard on the border of the tolerable. We know this above all from a letter of the Aggsbach prior, Thomas of Zistersdorf. He asked Schliedbacher to apologize for the harassment of the stubborn old monk. It is not entirely clear what he means, but the choice is abundant, from biting criticism of indulgences and the Turkish war to nasty insults of all the popes in office in this time. The peak is probably reached by the spiteful commentary on the election of the almost 80-year-old Borgia Pope Calixtus III. So Vincent comments, the church has already endured 2 bitter chalices, but the worst is this 3rd chalice, tertius calix. The cardinals have not chosen a man full of life, but this in German, einen alten Feister. So in Austrian dialect, this is an old fart. So to the contents. Thus, it is clear that mystical theology and theological problems in general represent only one dimension of the contents of these letters. There are 2 other thematic fields that are very closely connected with each other and with the theological content, namely first questions and answers about monastic life, and second political news and commentaries. So to the questions and answers. Not only in the Melk manuscript 1767, but also in numerous other miscellanies from the Benedictine monasteries of southern Germany, there is extensive material on individual questions of everyday monastic life. The closely interconnected monastic communities constantly asked each other about such things like the amount of prayer novices should offer, or the treatment of epileptics with hot stones. or appropriate clothing of monks, and so on. Often entire lists of questions were exchanged, and some questions of doubt caused veritable avalanches of tracts. The record is probably held by the problem of eating meat in Benedictine monasteries. Vincent of Aggsbach also belonged to the circle of the experts to be asked. Schlittbacher sought his advice again and again, and his answers circulated, of course, within the monastic public. Mystical theology was only one of the several topics. Schlittbacher asked Vincent's opinion about the mystic Dorothea of Prussia, who was venerated as a saint, and he asked him about he asked him to comment on the children's pilgrimage to Mont Saint-Michel that was taking place at this time. So pilgrimage we had yesterday. Both were highly controversial topics. The Prussian mystic was somewhat suspect. The canonization process has long been stalled. The children's pilgrimage was firmly rejected in learned circles and partly forbidden by episcopal authorities. Vincent, however, responded positively in both cases, almost euphorically. God expresses himself in our times precisely through simple women and children. Behind this was a deep mistrust of ecclesiastical authorities and scholastic teachings. In all cases, even in the context of mystical theology and also in the context of these peregrinaciones, he returns again and again to his core political theme, the longing for a new council. So my second points to the contents, political news. From Vincent's side, the greed for political news was the dominant concern of the letters. Again and again, he asked for current news about popes and princes, imperial diets and synods. And there was always the desperate hope that a new council could come about after all, in which Vincent saw the only way to reform Christian life. It was the vision of life of a whole generation of clerics who 30 years earlier welcomed with great enthusiasm the Council of Basel. In southern Germany in particular, and especially in the Carthusian monasteries, this enthusiasm continued to be influential for a long time, even when the pitiful remnants of the Council of Basel had dissolved in Lausanne in 1449. The deep mistrust of Nicholas of Cusa as a representative of the anti-conciliar and corrupt curia, as well as the mockery of the Jubilee indulgence and the Turkish War, are ultimately due to this vision of life, which the Carthusian, now 70 years old, could not abandon. In the solitude of the monastery cell, the unshakable belief in the infallible truth of the conciliar thought could also become a lifeline. The polemical sharpness of his statements on the popes, on Nicholas of Cusa, but also on mystical theology, and even the sarcastic mockery against his intimate epistolary friend Schlittbacher can also be explained by his frustration with church politics. So to conclude, what does all this mean for the interpretation of the mystic controversy? The involvement in the conventions of letter writing and in the content dimensions of the correspondence reveal the text to be highly ephemeral phenomena that cannot easily be used as reservoirs of timeless arguments and contributions to a discourse. They fulfilled certain functions in the concrete situation, which were decoupled from the actual theological essence, but nevertheless determined judgment and style. The often mocking degradations of any person suspected of challenging the authority of the councils through their involvement in the ecclesiastical hierarchy and their scholastic systems of thought was actually not grounded in substantive dissent. Basically, Vincent could also find much of interest in the teachings of Nicholas of Cusa even. So he praised the treatise De Visione Dei and even considered De Docta Ignorantia to be useful. By the way, he had never read the text itself. His attacks actually continued the polemical war of treatises of the conciliar period, but now in the protected framework of these cedulae incluse. At least in the exchange with the likewise conciliarist Johannes Schliedbacher, the holy rest of the true church had to remain alive. This observation matches the ways in which polemical texts from the council period were propagated. In the miscellanies, in these codices, conciliarist and anti-conciliarist statements are usually not mixed, but rather separated from one another. People prefer to exchange views on politically sensitive topics with like-minded people. This was true for the late medieval exchange of manuscripts, as it is today for pub discussions and Twitter clusters. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Tom and Sam. We can have questions and discussion for, we've got approximately about 25 minutes available to us if we would like to use that. Any questions? Somewhere along the way, I learned the expression roomies and zoomies. I'm looking at the roomies and the zoomies here. Not seeing any hands raised from either party. There we go, Chris Valletta.
I'd like to ask Sam about other lists.
Yeah.
Right. So this is after the speculative. Chris. And this list is after the 1403 treatise, right? This one that you talked about, this book list.
Is after what?
Is after which of Gerson's treaties? It's the 1403 speculative.
Yeah, no, it's after the, as far as I understand, I haven't looked at the manuscripts, but I think it's ended after the practical treatise. But it's speculative to practical, at least in the critical edition, that's where it's at. And it's not in all the manuscripts. And it's not in the printed editions I looked at, and I didn't get into all this, it's not there.
It's not in Japan or Gloria.
Yeah, it's first printed in Dai at the end of that. And in my essay, I say it's less a list of mystical theology for Dai and seems more so as a paratext for Gerson. But sorry.
Well, because the reason I ask is that this pulls together some of the themes we've been talking about, right? So Cusanus, every now and then, not every now and then, he often seems to want to launch into the mystical world. Excuse me, but he's such a practical person. Gerson, one right after the other. In 1402, he gives those two long lectures that become Contra Curiositatem Studentium, which is a very practical curricular reform. But then within a few months, he writes on speculative theology.
Yeah.
And then he revisits that latter in 1418 on the Consolation of Theology. So what would be really interesting is if there are book lists after each of the three of them, because there are three different types of documents with different intents, and compare the book lists.
Yeah,
those.
I don't know.
I'm giving you more work, but I'm
No,
saying,
it's interesting.
but it gives you that insight into, because Gerson, in Cusan fashion, also has these two aspects of him. He's a very practical man, but Gerson is much more comfortable launching into the stratosphere than Cusan is.
And the place to start is with, the scholar's name is skipping my head, who wrote the book on Gerson's lists and recommended reading lists. Tom, what's his name?
Dan Hobbins?
Yeah,
Dan
Hobbins' book was
Yeah.
where I would start to look for and the first chapter deals with like the construction of the great book lists. It's really interesting because Gerson also gives instructions on how to read. And he says like be aware of the titles, but choose a few select ones and read through them intensely. And so he's giving instructions on reading practices too. That's that would be the only place I know to look for those lists.
And the one person to it was Bernard on that list? Your list?
Bernard
Clairvaux?
yes.
Because I think he has a much greater influence on Gerson. I think some people have just kind of poked at it a little bit,
Okay.
but I think there's a much stronger influence on Gerson than we've explored.
Let me ask if the people on Zoom can hear the people in the room when they talk with their masks on. You can? Okay, good. Are there other questions? Oh, Aaron. Okay.
Hi, this is also a question for Sam. Thanks for your paper, Sam. Those lists are so fascinating. I was just wondering what you make of Hugh of Balma's claim that I think even an unlettered layperson can experience mystical theology because it's written on the heart by, I think, divine illumination. So how you're sort of reconciling that with what you were saying about mystical theology being pure prayer for the perfect among the religious?
Thank you. And hi, Aaron. This is actually a question I wanted to kick to Thomas Woelki and to Thomas Izbicki. And I'm glad I'll give my thoughts on it and then kick it to them. I think it's an important question. So I'm just reading Hugh of Balma and reading how I think these two triads tended to overlap. So the interesting thing is Hugh of Balma's Road to Zion Mourns has a really strong polemic, against scholastic approaches to mystical theology. Think Albert the Great. So I have a tendency to read some of it in that treatise as a polemic. That has been my tendency. When the appeal to the laity and to the unlearned, I've wondered, we're talking about Carthusians here, right? Which is like a renewed eremitic cloistered lifestyle, where these aren't mendicants, and he's writing against the learnedness of the mendicants. So but this is not my question, but I've tended to try to push back a little bit on how mystical theology gets used as like this democratization. And then to say like a lot of the reason why it was secret or hidden, which is what mystical means, is because it was available to the perfect. And the instructions are very clear. I don't think, Hugh of Balma makes a really strong distinction between mystical theology and contemplation. And so some of the arguments he's making about what we call democratization of this prayer, he's making about discursive, the purgative way. But when he gets to the end and he's talking about mystical theology, I think it's not democratic, but that's my thoughts. And I would be really interested to hear Thomas Woelki, who's looked at the letters in the question of, the Prussian mystic and the children pilgrimage. If later, this is not Hugh of Balma, but if Vincent of Aggsbach is like supporting popular piety like that, that would be a good rebuttal of what I just said.
Yes, I think it matches very well your definition of mystical theology as an instruction to pray. It matches very well with the way in which Vincent of Aggsbach works. It's not this scholastic treatise, and his central concern is to leave this practice or this notion open to not learned people. So for himself, perhaps he felt involved himself because he had not university formation, but especially this practice cannot be reserved to persons implicated in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. So this association of intellect with authority, this is the decisive point. So the difference between Vincent and the others is that intellect is not needed, and so intellect by him, he sees it as always linked with authority, ecclesiastical authority, and that's the point. That's what disturbs him.
Thank you. We have a question from Sam Bodinet. Where are you zooming in from, Sam?
I'm from Chicago. Yeah, I'm in Chicago. I guess I have a question for Sam. Thank you, Sam, for your paper. I really enjoyed it. I found it very interesting. And I think it also relates to this point about democratization and the perfect and where mystical theology lies, or who theologizes mystically and how. And I'm wondering about Gerson's he has this, as well as deploying the threefold, right, that you point to, he also does tend to deploy this distinction between the proper theology or an ordinary theology that he aligns with this, like a scholastic methodology, and then this thing that is mystical theology, right? I'm thinking in particular, I've got my Gerson in front of me. The letter 26, where he has this remarkable little statement, it's on page 251, where he refers to this subject. He says, the subject with which the third part of the aforenamed treatise deals, and he's polemicizing against Risbrook here, comes from the contents of Holy Scripture, or more correctly, from the highest theology, which is called mystical, and which in a scholastic manner, Albert the Great and certain others dealt with in their own clear language. So I wonder, what you make of that dichotomy between the scholastic and the theology for him, who's obviously sort of more sympathetic to the scholastic project than, say, Hugh of Balma would be, and how that might sort of impact this list of authors. And then another question is, have you tracked Gerson's use of these authors in his writings? I know that, for instance, John Climacus shows up a lot in his treatise on the discernment of spirits in interesting ways. So just to see, and precisely actually in order to re-articulate or re-express the scholastic magister's right to correct the sort of emotional sort of expressivity of the lay theologian, right? Not in order to shut them down, but in order to bring everyone towards what Gerson sort of envisages as proper theology or one mode of theology. So thanks again for your talk, and those are my questions.
Yeah, Sam, thank you. It's nice to see you. And I want to thank you for pointing me to that letter. And I think I probably am overemphasizing the point of Hugh. I think when I look at the lists, I'm bringing in Hugh of Balma. I'm bringing in how I think the category is developing. So I think my reading of Gerson and your distinction between how Gerson talks about scholastic mystical theology and maybe what this other I'm describing, I need to reapproach that. And so I guess I would just say that that's my method, is I've been looking at the list, and I'm probably not I'm also trying to make an argument that in order to consider the contours of mystical theology, what difference does it make when we look at these lists and the catalogs and the Carthusian Charter House, instead of just doing a systematic analysis of an author's works? And so, but I also need to do that, and be aware of that. And I would be interested in hearing from you, because, you've worked a lot more on Albert the Great and are more attuned to the scholastic mystical theology project. And mine's pushing more towards that kind of contemplative prayer practice the more and more I work on it. And I think I will follow up with you, and I want to know what you think about your own question, if that's fair.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit about this later, but I tend to think that the early Gerson, and I'm not alone in this, is very Albertist, right? Whereas the latter, Gerson, increasingly distances himself from Albert because he's having this sort of polemic with the Albertist tradition that's constellating around a particular peripatetic philosophy at the University of Paris, which maybe isn't as Albertist, right, as they claim it to be. And you know, Zenon Kaluza and some French scholars have done good work on that. But yeah, sure, maybe we can talk about it, over drink sometime.
Through chat, Bill Highland has indicated that he has a question. But Bill, could you unmute yourself?
Yes, hi. This is kind of I guess it's a question, but it's kind of an observation as well about Gerson. It's very interesting how he endorses Bonaventure as someone who both, as he enkindles the heart, but also engages the intellect, that he does both. And he sees that as kind of an ideal. And I just wonder if there's not necessarily a dichotomy in his mind, as much as some of the disputes would lead one to believe, if he could focus on someone as Bonaventure as someone whom he thinks joins in a sense, the two things together, and writes in different genres, which is another, because Bonaventure invents genres, he crosses genres for different audiences. So I'm just wondering if there isn't so much a dichotomy in Gerson all the time.
Would one of the speakers like to respond to that? Tom?
I think it's quite apparent that Gerson has a chronology, even if one was only looking at the more spiritual works. And that I think Fisher is right, that the Anagogicum marks a change not toward the intellectual, but away from emphasizing either the affect or the intellect, toward entering a darkness which is beyond those human capacities. I also think that there's a whole question here. If you look at Gerson versus this question that has risen here about, can you democratize spirituality? Because Gerson seems to come down on both sides of the question of whether women can have mystical experiences, depending on which work you're reading at the moment. So, considering he was active for about 30 years, we can't expect him, as I think Vincent did, to have a single viewpoint. He does change. Plus, he's running this whole other set of concerns with the university, with the schism, and it's very clear that with the schism, he moves away from a stance that's favorable to the Avignon claimant, if only tentatively, toward a conciliarism that becomes his major ecclesiological church. So we have to look at this in terms of there are sort of arcs parallel to one another, the different things he's doing over a 30-year career, including moments when he's had to go into hiding to save his heart.
Thank you. Paula has a question from Buenos Aires.
Yes, hello. It's a question for Thomas Woelki, but perhaps for Tom Izbicki as well. Thomas, you linked authority with intellect, right, in Vincent's mind. And that led me to think or remember that Vincent accused Nicholas of resisting the Holy Spirit. Remember, because the Holy Spirit had spoken at Basel and Nicholas had aligned himself with the Pope. And thinking that the Holy Spirit is love, and thinking also of this apparent opposition between love and intellect, I wonder and that is my question, whether perhaps one could establish a relation, perhaps in Vincent's mind only, but not only between intellect and vertical authority, but on the one side, right? But also on the other, between love and horizontal consensus.
Okay. Okay. The accusation to have resisted the Holy Spirit is to be understood in a very technical, political way. The Council of Basel has the claim to represent the voice of the Holy Spirit. It's represented in the formula of every chart, and so it's quite technical that if you resist in the validity of the decrees and the decisions of the councils, etc., and if you fight against the council, you fight against the Holy Spirit. So this is quite clear. And in the text, I don't see the love connection in this. So perhaps it is, but I've looked only on this political level and was quite coherent to me. So it was very theological approach to these writings. Okay.
Thomas, Izbicki, do you want to add anything?
Really don't have anything I'd like to add on that particular point. I've been sitting here trying to remember something that's related to some of these themes, which is how one of the writers brings Dorothy of Montel into the picture. It may have been very offensive. Do you remember that? And it's in one of the texts of the papers that they came up with. Since I don't have all the papers here with me, remember where that arises, because it ties in with this question of possible horizontality of the affect.
Is that the Prussian mystic that Woelki mentioned, or is this a different figure?
I don't think they can hear you.
Story of Montel? Is that the figure you're asking about?
Yes.
So, yeah. Did Woelki get that?
I don't know. Thomas, did you hear the question?
No, I never have not realized. No.
I think I would get it right if I tried.
Yeah, so Tom is asking Dorothea of Montel? Dorothea of Montel? Dorothea of Montel, the third time. Where does Vincent of Aggsbach or someone interact with her?
Now, mentions her
Mentions
in
her
positive terms.
in positive terms.
What the people Kepler writes about in terms of being sort of troubled spirits, but if you're quoting a specific female mystic in positive terms, it's just not contributing to support of the affect as crucial.
Yeah.
And this is the last one.
So to can I allora to the discussion about Dorothea of Montal was started by Schliedbacher. He asked him what does he think about Dorothea of Prussia, of Montal, and if he has the texts circulating in the monasteries. And Vincent of Aggsbach had more information about this from the Carthusian network, so from the Charterhouse of Prague. He had some texts circulated in these networks, and so it was the part of this manuscript exchange. And so also in this occasion, Vincent discusses the authority of councils. It was not clear why, but he takes every occasion to go on this topic.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes. Anyone else? I'd like to thank the three speakers for a very stimulating. Make one little closing comment of my own. When I was in high school, John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev couldn't talk to each other on the phone to prevent a world war. And here I am chairing a session with people on 3 continents talking very freely to one another. I'm glad we don't have a war to prevent. But thank you all for joining us.